In Module 2 of Pharmacology 1, we will begin discussing all about ANS drugs. Particularly, in this topic, we will first discuss the principles of autonomic nervous system. Now, the importance of discussing first ANS, the autonomic nervous system, the physiology of autonomic nervous system is for you to appreciate the action of drugs later on, because we all know that drugs modify the function of the body. It modifies the bio biological structures, the physiological structures of the body. So that's why we need to understand first what is all about autonomic nervous system based on its physiology. So first up, we will discuss here the organization of the nervous system in general. Now, when we talk about organization, we are referring here to the anatomical organization of the nervous system. Meaning to say, this tells us something about anatomy, about the organs, about the structural features of the nervous system. Now, when we talk of the anatomical organization of the nervous system, there are actually three organs that are found here. Again, meron tayong tatlong organ found in the nervous system. Number one, of course, we have the brain. Okay. Second, we have the spinal cord. Okay. And lastly, the neurons. Okay. Neurons, parte din to ng nervous system. I repeat, we have the brain, the spinal cord, and these neurons. Okay. They are found in the nervous system. Now, we can have an organization of the anatomical structures of the nervous system. Okay? Particularly, there are two main organization of the nervous system. Number one, we have the central nervous system, okay, or the CNS. Now, when we talk about CNS, okay, I know you're familiar with central nervous system. This is comprised of the brain. Okay, this is comprised of the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, again, uh, central nervous system. Okay, given this skeletal illustration, the CNS consists of the brain. Okay, this would be the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, this would be the usual skeletal representation or skeletal illustration of CNS, which comprises the brain and the spinal cord. Next, the other anatomical division of the nervous system is the peripheral nervous system. Okay, the peripheral nervous system. When we say peripheral nervous system, this is composed of different neurons. Okay, different neurons that are located outside the CNS. Okay, or basically outside the brain and outside the spinal cord. Again, ang nagko-comprise sa peripheral nervous system ay mga nerves, no? Mga nerves, neurons na makikita outside the brain and the spinal cord. Ngayon, the usual skeletal representation or illustration of neuron looks like this. Okay? Ito yung usual na representation ng neuron or nerve, skeletal one. Now, let us give focus this time on these neurons. Okay? Again, focus tayo ngayon sa neurons. Take note that when we say neurons or nerves outside the CNS, based on functions po, based on their functions, meron tayong dalawang klase ng neurons based on functions. Again, when we talk about neurons, based on functions, there are two types, two classes ng neurons. First, may mga neurons tayo na tinatawag na afferent. Okay? Again, una, may mga neurons tayo na tinatawag na afferent neurons or the sensory neurons. Okay? Again, afferent neurons, these are also known as sensory neurons. Now, ano yung ibig sabihin ng afferent or sensory neurons? Now, when we say afferent or sensory neurons, these are the neurons that enter the CNS. Take note, afferent or sensory nerves or sensory neurons, these are the neurons that enter, okay, the CNS. So, ito yung mga neurons na nagdadala ng impulses or let's say nagdadala ng balita papasok ng ating utak. So, kapag ang isang neuron enters the central nervous system, particularly in our brain, ibig sabihin, these neurons particularly carry impulses from the sensory organ towards the brain, going to the brain. Okay? So, yan yung inference natin kapag ang isang neuron papuntang CNS, ibig sabihin, yung neuron na yan carries impulses from the sensory organ going to the brain. Again, afferent or sensory neurons, they carry impulses from the sensory organ towards the brain. So, palapit ng utak. From sensory towards the brain. Now, after afferent neurons or sensory neurons, we also have the efferent neurons. Okay? Or these are also known as the motor neurons. Okay? So for efferent neurons naman, particularly, these are the neurons that leave the CNS. Okay? So please take note, efferent neurons, these are the neurons that leave the CNS. Ibig sabihin nito, yung motor neurons this time carry impulses from the brain, to the effector organ. Again, when we say motor neurons this time, it now carries impulses mula sa brain towards, okay, or going to the effector organ. So, mula utak papunta sa inuutusan niyang organ. yung mismong organ na mag-a-adjust sa situation, yung mismong effector organ, yung organ na mag-produce ng effect or response. So these are the two classes of neurons, okay, including their differences. Again, we have afferent and we have the efferent neurons. Now, as you can observe also in the table, as you observed on the table, you can tell that under the peripheral nervous system, we have here the sensory pathways. We have the sensory pathways, which is ito yung afferent, okay, neurons. And then we have the motor pathways. These are the efferent neurons. Okay, so based on my discussion, let me check if you do really understand. Okay, so I'll be throwing questions. Pili lang mo if afferent ba or efferent yung sagot. Okay, isang question lang. Sa tingin nyo, between afferent or efferent neurons, saan kaya dito ang related sa tinatawag natin na stimulus? Between afferent or efferent neurons, saan dito ang related sa tinatawag na stimulus? Is it A afferent or E efferent? Stimulus, impulses. Okay. Okay. So yung sagot is afferent neuron. Now what about efferent? What about efferent neurons? Ano yung related dito? Ano yung related dito? It starts with letter R. Efferent effector organ. So, yung related naman dito is yung response. Alright? So, please take note. Stimulus, yung related dito, is yung sensory neuron or afferent neuron. Kapag naman response, yung related dito is yung efferent neuron or yung motor neurons. So, tandaan ha, kapag response, it is the motor neurons. Response, effect, it is the motor neurons. So, at least, now, alam nyo na ang mga functions, basic functions ng neurons na to. May mga neurons that carry stimulus towards the brain, and may mga neurons din naman na nagdadala ng utos mula utak papuntang sensory organ, producing a response. At this juncture, let us discuss further the motor neurons, okay, or these motor pathways. Based on the illustration, there are two subdivisions under motor pathways. Number one, we have the somatic nervous system, and second, we have the autonomic nervous system. Let us have first ANS, okay, or the autonomic nervous system. Okay, we can see here the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. Now, along with our preceding discussions in ANS, we will discuss more about these two subdivisions. Now, with this all taken together, we can now have an idea what is really an autonomic nervous system. So I'll try to wrap it, the whole idea that was just discussed earlier. Recall that autonomic nervous system, puro motor neurons yung nandito. Again, under ANS, okay, puro motor neurons yung nandito. Kumbaga, puro responses ang dala-dala ng autonomic nervous system. Also, makikita natin dito sa illustration na magkahiwalay ang somatic nervous system at ang ANS. With that being said, let me discuss the differences between somatic nervous system and autonomic nervous system. Again, at this juncture, we will discuss the differences between somatic and the autonomic nervous system. Okay? Actually, ito lang yun. Okay? Ito lang yung differences, big differences between somatic nervous system and autonomic nervous system. But for easier understanding, I will provide a skeletal illustration para mas madali lang maintindihan yung differences between these two main subdivision ng motor pathways. Okay? So first up, we have the somatic nervous system. Okay? So una tayo sa somatic nervous system. Somatic nervous system. Let's say for instance, this is the CNS. We have the brain. And then this would be the spinal cord. So apparently this is the CNS. Diba? CNS pa to. Okay? And in this part, we have here for instance, we have here the effector organ. Okay? Effector organ. Again, we have the CNS and the effector organ. Now, when we talk about somatic nervous system, okay, when we talk about somatic nervous system, in somatic nervous system, the bridge that connects the CNS to that of the effector organ is only a single neuron. Okay? Only a single neuron. Again, isang neuron lang ang nagko-connect or nagbe-bridge sa pagitan ng CNS at ng organ na inuutusan ng brain. Okay? So kung skeletal illustration ko, halimbawa, ito lang yung single neuron. Okay? Ayan. So that would be the skeletal illustration. Meron lang isang neuron na nagbe-bridge or nagko-connect sa pagitan ng CNS at ng organ, which is the effector organ. So this would be the somatic nervous system. In particular, this single neuron is known as the somatic neuron. Take note, this single neuron that bridges or connects CNS to the effector organ is what we call the somatic neuron or somatic nerve. Now, what about ANS? Okay, let's proceed to ANS. On the contrary, ang autonomic nervous system, this time it has two neurons. Take note, it has two neurons. Kumbaga, it is a two-neuron setup. Again, ang autonomic nervous system is a two-neuron setup. Okay? So, merong dalawang neurons that connects the CNS and the effector organ. So, example, Ulit, this is the brain. You have the brain here, and then you have the spinal cord, and this would be the effector organ. Then we have neuron 1. Ito. This would be the neuron 1. And we have the neuron 2. Okay? So there are two neurons that bridges the CNS to the effector organs. Now, meron tayong mga terminologies na dapat malaman or dapat familiar kayo about these neurons or related to these neurons. Okay? Specifically, those neurons na autonomically innervated. Okay? Under tayo sa ANS, ANS. Again, you have to know this not familiar, you have to familiarize these terminologies na related sa neurons that are autonomically innervated. So first, yung first neuron, the one that is on the left side, ito. Okay? Itong first neuron na to, okay, this is known as preganglion. Again, this is known as preganglion. Again, yung first neuron, the one that is on the left side or near the CNS, this is known as preganglion. Whereas the neuron that is near the effector organ, this is known as the postganglion. Right? I repeat, ito naman yung tinatawag na postganglion. So again, we have the preganglion and then the postganglion. Okay? The specific terminologies for the two neurons that connects CNS and effector organ in the autonomic nervous system. Now, everyone, please observe these necessary gaps. That is being observed or makikita nyo sa illustration. Itong gaps na to. Okay? As observed, di ba, may mga specific spaces here. So, please remember these spaces. You'll get to realize the importance of these gaps, the importance of these spaces later on. So, meron silang essence mamaya. Okay? So, balik tayo again sa ANS. Okay? Meron tayong dalawang neurons ulit that connects the CNS to the effector organ under ANS. You have the preganglion, the postganglion, and lastly, itong part na to. Okay? This part that is being highlighted with colored orange, this is called the ganglion. Okay? Ito naman, this is called the ganglion. Okay, again, we also have this specialized area in the ANS neurons, okay, the ganglion. Now, in particular, the ganglion is defined as aggregation, the aggregation or specifically collection of neurons, no? Collection or aggregation of neurons, cell bodies. Neurons, cell bodies. Okay? That are particularly located in the peripheral nervous system. Again, when we say ganglion, it is defined as the aggregation, the collection of neuron cell bodies found in the peripheral nervous system. So that is what we mean about the term ganglion. Now, please take note, class, that ganglion is exclusively found in the ANS. No, yung ganglion, exclusive lang siya na makikita sa autonomic nervous system, sa two neuron setup ng autonomic nervous system. Now, this time, let us now focus on the effector organs. Dito naman tayo sa mga effector organs ng somatic nervous system and that of the autonomic nervous system. Again, when we say effector organ, di ba? Ito yung organ na mag-a-adjust sa situations. Ito yung tatanggap, magre-receive ng utos mula sa brain, yung mismong inuutusan ng utak ng brain. Tandaan, ang sinusuplayan ng somatic nervous system ay mga effector organs like the skeletal muscles. Okay? So mainly mga skeletal muscles yung sinusuplayan ng somatic nervous system. These are the usual effector organs, okay, na sinusuplayan ng somatic nervous system. And just to give you an idea, pag sinabing skeletal muscles, based on your knowledge also sa human anaphysiology, di ba skeletal muscles are voluntary acting muscles. Diba? These are voluntary acting muscles. Voluntary. Okay? Acting muscles. Kumbaga controllable. No? Controllable yung responses nila. So ano yung inference dito? Ano yung conclusion natin dito? We can infer na ang kinokontrol, therefore, ng mga somatic nervous system ay mga voluntary mobility or voluntary motions. Okay? Now, kapag naman ANS or autonomic nervous system, usually ang kinokontrol ng ANS ay mga glands. Okay? Mga glands. Okay? Example ng glands, we have the lacrimal glands. Syempre, lacrimal glands, this is related to your eyes, yung pagluluha. What else? Sweat glands. Diba? Sweat glands, yung pagpapawis. Another is salivary glands, yung paglalaway. Diba? So those are examples of glands. So glands could be an effector organ ng ANS. Also, we have the smooth muscles, no? Smooth muscles. Okay? Wrong spelling. Ayan. So, when I say smooth muscles, halimbawa would be the vascular smooth muscles, the blood vessels, di ba? Yung gastrointestinal tract, halimbawa yung bituka, sikmura, di ba? Yan yung mga smooth muscles yan ng GIT. Bronchioles, yung bronchia, okay? Yung bronchi, smooth muscles din yan. Okay? Now, based on my descriptions on glands, on smooth muscles, mag-question ko, what do you think about these muscles? Okay, about these glands? Are these organs controllable or not? Can you control the secretion of your lacrimal fluids, your saliva, secretion of your saliva? Kaya nyo bang i-control yun? Yung digestion, kaya nyo bang i-control yun? Are these organs controllable? Yes or no? No. Kaya take note, class, ang ANS, from the term itself, di ba? Autonomic nervous system. From the term itself, autonomic. So, responsible siya sa involuntary motions or involuntary mobilities. Alright? So basically, these are the differences of somatic nervous system and autonomic nervous system. That is why in this figure, you can now understand the illustration, okay, presented, including the labeled terms, no? Mga labeled terminology. Sige, let's try to look at the figure above first. This is ANS, no? The autonomic nervous system. Then we have here the preganglion, the preganglionic neuron. And then we also have the postganglion and the ganglion. So I have discussed this already in skeletal illustration earlier. Then this illustration below, this is the somatic nervous system. We have the somatic neuron here. Ayan, yung tawag natin sa single neuron that connects the CNS to the effector organ under SNS. And ano sabi natin sa effector organ ng SNS or somatic nervous system? We have skeletal muscles as an examples. Okay, example. Okay? And kapag naman ANS, effector organs includes the glands and the smooth muscles. Okay? Kaya nga kung babalikan natin, okay, try natin balikan yung diagram na to. Ito. Kung babalikan natin yung diagram na to, kanina, yung naka-highlight sa autonomic nervous system, di ba? Naka-highlight dito yung term or word na involuntary. And for somatic nervous system, naka-enclose naman dito yung term na voluntary. So, yan yung reason. Bakit? Basta somatic, may voluntary, autonomic, involuntary. It has something to do with their effector organs being innervated. Okay? So, I hope nako-connect niyo yung mga slides being presented. Now, bago tayo mag-proceed with this slide, let us try to check, no, if nakuha yung first few concepts of nervous system. Okay? Tell me if, I know you're all listening, although this is just recorded, no, pre-recorded, but I know you are learning. Okay? So tell me if it is related to somatic nervous system or related ba siya sa autonomic nervous system. Okay? So I will be mentioning terms. You just have to answer if it is related to somatic or autonomic nervous system. Okay? Single neuron. Single neuron. Alright, somatic. Ganglion. Ganglion. Autonomic. Voluntary. Somatic. Two neuron system. Two neurons. Autonomic. Involuntary. Alright, autonomic. So I know with that basic information, nakuha niyo yung difference between somatic and autonomic nervous system. Now let us proceed to the next portion of our discussion, which is all about synaptic neurotransmission. Again, we will now discuss another portion of our discussion. Dito naman, we will have an explanation on the term synaptic neurotransmission. Now, when we say synaptic neurotransmission, this is defined as the mechanism of impulse transmission. Okay? Again, when we say synaptic neurotransmission, mechanism of impulse transmission. Okay? Across the synapse. I repeat, when we talk of synaptic neurotransmission, this explains the mechanism of impulse transmission across the so-called synapse. Now, for you to understand this definition, let us highlight uh, the terms impulse. Highlight natin yung term na impulse, tsaka yung synapse. Okay? So, unahin natin yung term na impulse. Okay, let's start with the term impulse. Class. Para dali lang madumduman ha. When you hear about impulse, please take note na I am referring to the utos, no? Or yung mismong balita that is coming from the CNS. Okay? That is coming from the CNS. Particularly coming from the brain. Siyempre, it is the brain that make utos, diba? Or that sends impulses towards the effector organ. Again, take note ninyo, impulse, ito yung utos, balita, coming from the brain, okay, towards the effector organ. Then when we say synapse, this is the so-called interface. Ito naman yung interface or uh, an area. This is an area of connection. Okay? Area of connection. Synapse, area of connection, or ito yung interface between two structures. Between two structures. I repeat, when you say synapse, ito yung interface or an area of connection between two structures. Area of connection between two structures. So that's what we mean of the term synapse. Now, when we put all these terms together, ano ngayon particularly yung ibig sabihin ng synaptic neurotransmission? Now, para maintindihan, remember that the nervous system, okay, take note nyo, that the nervous system as highlighted earlier, take note, it is a discontinuous system. Diba? I have highlighted this earlier na ang nervous system discontinuous system siya. Ano ibig sabihin ng discontinuous system? Okay? Sabi natin, 'di ba, if this is the CNS, okay, and then the effector organ, CNS, and then effector organ, okay, under ANS, ayan. Okay, using the skeletal illustration, we can actually understand that this discontinuous system that is observed in a nervous system. Okay, for example, you have this brain. Ayan. Ito yung brain, diba? Ito yung brain. And then the effector organ. Tandaan na hindi po tuloy-tuloy ang connection or bridge mula CNS going to the effector organ. Hindi siya, ano ba, what I mean here is, hindi directly connected yung neurons, okay, that bridges the CNS to the effector cell. Hindi literal na magkadikit. Hindi continuous, hindi tuloy-tuloy. Okay? Yung neurons that connects the CNS to the effector cell. Kasi nga, may presence of gaps. Di ba? Ito, may mga spaces. Okay? May mga spaces in between. And ang tawag po dyan sa mga spaces, or sa mga gaps na ito are synapse. Ito yung synapse. Okay? Synapse. That is why nervous system is said to be a discontinuous system. So again, based on this illustration, we can tell ito yung mga spaces or gaps na makikita natin sa pagitan ng dalawang structures. Again, ang tawag dito ay synapse. Okay, so I hope ma-visualize niyo yung ibig sabihin ng synapse that I am referring to the spaces, the area of connection between two structures in a form of spaces or gaps. Ngayon, we can now generalize these concepts to help us understand the term synaptic neurotransmission. So generally, I will explain to you, okay, in this slide, how can the how can the impulse generated by the brain eventually reaches the effector organ, considering na merong gaps or spaces in between. Paano kaya makakarating yung utos mula brain papuntang effector organ? Okay, so explain natin yan in this slide. Okay? Okay, so we will explain that concept using this sample illustration. For instance, suppose this is coming from the brain. Okay? Ito. Alright. Ito. Suppose this is coming from the brain. Okay? Galing to sa brain. Now, as we all know, yung utos, yung mismong utos or balita coming from the brain, it will travel through the neurons. That is why may arrow. Diba? May arrow. It will travel. Okay? It will travel. Okay? Yung neurons, it will travel. Sumula sa utak, it will travel through the neurons. Example, using the sending neuron. Okay? Now, when the time comes na nakaabot siya in this part, okay, itong part na to, nakaabot siya dito sa dulo. Ayan, nakaabot siya dito sa dulo. Ayan. Terminal part ng sending neuron. Recall na hindi po directly connected ang sending neuron sa receiving neuron. They are not totally continuous. Dahil nga may gaps, di ba? May gaps which are known as synapse. Now, if we magnify itong part na to, itong synapse ba? Itong space na to, if kanang nakabox, itong nakabox na part dito. If you try to magnify that space or this gap in between sending neuron and receiving neuron, this is how it looks. Itong nasa right side na illustration ngayon. Again, itong illustration on the right side, yung nasa box, okay, ito, yung nasa box, this is the magnified space, the magnified gap between the two neurons, between the sending neuron and between the terminal portion ng sending neuron. Kasi andito, di ba? Terminal part ng dulo na part ng sending neuron. Okay? Between the terminal part ng sending neuron and the initial part ng receiving neuron. So let's say this part. Okay, let's say itong part na to. Okay, in the magnified illustration, this is the terminal portion of the sending neuron. Okay, terminal portion ng sending neuron. And then below here, ito. Below is of course, the initial portion of the receiving neuron, the neuron that is near the effector cell. Diba? Yung receiving neuron, ito yung near the effector cell. The sending neuron, ito yung near the brain near the CNS. Now we have certain technical terms as well. No, we have certain technical terms that uh, that is also related to the parts of the synapse. Okay, yung na-magnify na, yung minagnify na illustration on the right side. May mga certain terms na dapat familiar din kayo. Okay, in relation to the parts of synapse. So number one, please take note, yung dulo ha, yung dulo ng unang neuron or the terminal portion, itong terminal portion ng sending neuron, this is called as the pre-synapse. Take note. Okay? Take note ha. Ito yung pre-synapse, yung terminal portion of the sending neuron. And then itong actual space na to, okay, yung actual space in this magnified synapse, this is what we call the synaptic cleft. Okay, synaptic, synaptic cleft. I repeat, kapag magnified na, tiningnan ng malapitan ba, okay, yung synapse, ang tawag sa space na yon ay synaptic cleft. And the last part, itong part na to, yung initial portion ng receiving neuron, this is the post-synapse. Please take note of the terms. Okay? Post-synapse. Again, there are three parts of the magnified view of synapse. These are the pre-synapse, the synaptic cleft, and the post-synapse. Now, kindly note that in each area that is being mentioned, there are certain events, there are certain processes that occur. In addition, there can be structures found from each areas or substances that is found in each area. So let us start with pre-synapse. Okay? Please take note that in pre-synapse, synthesis, storage, and also release of neurotransmitters occur. Take note. I repeat, in pre-synapse, synthesis, storage, and also release of neurotransmitters occur. Okay? Later, it will be much more clearer, okay, sa atong mga proceeding presentations or slides. This will be elaborated later on. So take note lang sa ninyo ang necessary events or processes that is related to each part. So synthesis, storage, and release of neurotransmitters took place in pre-synapse. Now, when we talk about storage, okay, this tells something. This tells something about the form, okay, of storage na involves sa neurotransmitters. Yung mismong form ng storage, ano ba yung storage involved sa mga neurotransmitters. Particularly, that storage, okay, is in the form of vesicles. Take note, that storage of neurotransmitters are in the form of vesicles. Alright? And then kapag naman release, that is via the process called exocytosis. Again, release of neurotransmitters is via exocytosis. Okay? So ulitin ko ha. Ang storage in the form of vesicles, then release of neurotransmitters is through exocytosis. Still under presynapse. Okay, still under presynapse. Also, there are enzymes found in here. Okay, please take note, sa presynapse, there are enzymes present. Now, what should we realize kapag may enzymes that exists in a certain area? You know this already. Recall nyo yung pharmacokinetic principles. I have mentioned there rationale about enzymes. Kapag may enzymes in general, di ba? Pag may presence ng enzymes in general that can cause chemical reaction. What is that chemical reaction in particular? Meaning with enzymes, this can induce letter M, starts with letter M. Yes, they can induce metabolism. Okay? So, posibleng mangyari yung metabolism. Now, the mere fact, no? The mere fact na yung enzymes are present in this pre-synapse, may enzymes in pre-synapse, metabolism may occur there, no? Now, aside from enzymes, still under pre-synapse, receptors are also found here. Receptors are also found here. Particularly, I am referring to the receptors. Okay? Again, under presynapse, receptors are found in here, particularly receptors. I am referring to receptors found in pre-synapse. Next, let us proceed to synaptic cleft. No, synaptic cleft. In the cleft, yung importance naman niya is that enzymes are found here. Yun lang. Okay? Enzymes are found here. So, may enzymes found in the cleft. So, repetition is learning. Sige nga, what happened if there are enzymes? What happened if there are enzymes? Metabolism occurs. Okay? And finally, in the post-synapse, please take note that majority of the receptors, okay, majority of receptors are found in here. Okay, found on the post-synapse. Again, karamihan ng mga receptors, majority ng mga receptors naka-implant, naka-locate dito sa post-synapse. Also, presence of enzymes, okay, may be observed. Okay? So, alam niyo na ulit, pag may enzymes, if there's presence of enzymes, therefore, merong metabolism. So, please take note ha. Please take note of all these important processes per areas in the synapse. Okay? And actually, this picture, itong picture na to, itong magnified nga portion ng synapse. I'm sorry. Ayan. Okay. This tells us the information that I just discussed earlier about the terminologies pre-synapse, synaptic cleft, post-synapse. Sige, tingnan natin yung illustration. Okay. Una, di ba, we have synthesized neurotransmitters. Yan. Okay. We have neurotransmitters, okay, that are synthesized. Okay. And they are being stored sa mga bilog. They are being stored sa mga circles, sa mga bilog. Ang tawag sa mga bilog na yan, vesicles. So, may synthesis, may storage in the form of vesicles for neurotransmitters. Also, may enzymes, no? May enzymes found in the pre-synapse. Okay? Also, we have the process of release of neurotransmitters via exocytosis. Okay? Via exocytosis. Ito yon, no? Yung process of release. okay, ng neurotransmitters. Then, in the synaptic cleft, dito sa synaptic cleft, sabi natin, may enzymes, no? So, ayan, may enzymes. And then we have the receptors in the receiving neurons, no? In the post-synapse. Okay, may mga receptors. Majority of the receptors are found here. So these are the parts of synapse. Okay, the presynapse, synaptic cleft, and the post-synapse. Now, these are very important, ha? Very important that you memorize all this. Kasi prerequisite ito to understand the latter portion of our discussion. Okay, so, sige, as early as now, let's try to memorize these processes. Okay? Kasi later on, sa mga other discussions nato, proceeding discussions, we will have a chorus interaction with regards also in relation with the topics na in relation to this concept. Sige, so as early as now, you memorize this, the importance of these parts, what happens or what are the processes involved in each parts of the synopsis. So I'll give you a minute, okay, 1 minute while you are listening to this pre-recorded video, 1 minute to memorize this slide. Okay? Paki-memorize yung essence ng pre-synapse, synaptic cleft, and post-synapse. Okay, 1 minute starts now. And then I will ask questions after a minute para at least man lang you can think, no? And it will also help you memorize easily the concepts. Okay. Sige. So, try natin. Try natin yung self-assessment, no? Self-assessment lang. You can pause the video to think and answer and then play it again. Okay? Sige, just answer. Just answer if it is pre-synapse, post-synapse, or all. Again, yung sagot nyo lang is either pre-synapse or post-synapse or all. Okay? Depende kung ano yung related. Okay? Saan related yung term I will be mentioning. Okay? You can just answer it silently. Okay, number 1. Vesicles. Okay, pre-synapse. Exocytosis. Pre-synapse. Metabolism. All. Majority of receptors. Majority of receptors. Post-synapse. Enzymes. All. Synthesis of neurotransmitters. Pre. Storage of neurotransmitters. Alright, pre-synapse. Majority of receptors. Okay, post-synapse. Release of neurotransmitters. Pre-synapse. Okay, so that could benefit you much, no? So, as early as now, you have at least master these parts ng synapses. Kasi, again, later on, you will get to appreciate all these parts kapag ma-encounter na nato ang mga drugs, ang pharmacology on autonomic nervous system, drugs that affect ANS. Okay, next slide tayo. Now, your learnings on the previous slide, it will help you much easily, especially in understanding this slide. Okay? In particular for this slide, we will discuss what are the specific steps. Now, what are the specific steps involved in synaptic neurotransmission? Okay. Again, in the slide, we will be learning those specific steps, each steps involved in synaptic neurotransmitter. Okay. So, kumbaga, i-explain ko step by step paano ba yung mga yung each steps, ano ba yung mga each steps that occur para yung utos, yung impulse, okay, that is being generated by the brain, okay, makarating siya sa mismong effector organ. Considering na may mga spaces, no, in between the structures. Okay? So suppose we have an impulse, no? We have an utos. Okay, take note. Okay? For instance, we have an impulse or utos being generated by from the brain or coming from the brain that reaches this area. Okay? Now, para dili mo malibog, no? Para dili mo maliubog. Let us first, let us first recognize the different parts ng synapses. Okay? I-recognize na nato. Okay, basing nawala mo nga lahi na pud lagi ni siya nga figure, ma'am. Sige, ato siyang i-recognize sa mga different parts illustrated. First part, this is the presynaptic cell. Itong part na to. Okay? And then, we have this cleft, itong space. Okay? Then, of course, we have the postsynaptic cell. Okay? So, okay na tayo. We have the presynapse, synaptic cleft, and the postsynapse in the bottom. Now, suppose there is an impulse. So, merong impulse, utos coming from the brain that reaches this area. Okay? Nakarating sa presynapse. Okay? Nakarating sa presynaptic cell. So, this causes an action potential. Take note, kapag may impulse, the moment na may impulse, may utos mula sa brain na nakarating sa presynapse, sa terminal portion ng sending neuron, presynapse, that causes an action potential. Okay? Again, that causes an action potential. Okay? An action potential will be generated specifically in the presynaptic cell or in the axon terminal. Okay, axon terminal, that is simply the terminal portion of the nerve, the sending neuron. Okay, terminal portion ng sending neuron, which is the presynapse, the presynaptic cell. Okay, ulitin ko ha. Kapag may impulse na nakarating sa presynapse, okay, sa axon terminal, action potential will be generated. Tandaan, when we say action potential, when action potential happens, there is depolarization. Ito yung tandaan nyo. Okay? Kapag may action potential being generated, depolarization occurs, okay, in the presynaptic cell membrane. And what do we expect kapag depolarized ang isang cell? Ano yung expected nga response kapag depolarized ang isang cell? Is it depressed or stimulated yung cell? Recall, stimulated ngayon yung presynaptic cell membrane. Okay? I repeat, yung action potential causes stimulation or depolarization of the presynaptic cell membrane. Now, kapag na-stimulate ang presynapse, na-stimulate, okay, na-stimulate na yung part na to, na-stimulate siya because of that impulse, no? Na-stimulate siya caused by the impulse resulting to depolarization. What will happen now? That will cause opening of the voltage-gated calcium ion channel. Okay? Kapag na-stimulate yung presynapse, nagkukos yan ng opening of the voltage-gated calcium ion channel. Kaya makikita ninyo sa figure, dito sa figure, okay, yung nasa gitna, ito yung calcium ion channel, the voltage-gated calcium ion channel. It will open. Okay? It will open and as a result, syempre, it will now allow the influx of calcium ion. Ibig sabihin ng influx of calcium ion, ang calcium ions mula sa outside, sa extracellular cell, okay, extracellular part, it will enter. Okay? It will enter the cell. Okay? Papasok siya inside the cell. Now, question, ano ba ang function ng calcium in relation to these processes? Ano yung function ng calcium in relation to these processes? Take note that calcium causes movement of the stored form of neurotransmitters or the vesicles. Okay? Take note, yung gagawin ng calcium kapag present na siya inside the cell membrane of presynapse, that will tend to signal vesicles. Okay? It will cause movement ng mga neurotransmitters mula sa loob papalabas, okay, ng vesicles. Okay, again, due to the entry of calcium ion, this causes movement of the stored neurotransmitter or the vesicles until such time that these vesicles will bind to what we call docking proteins. Okay, itong naka-arrow dyan. Okay, yan yung docking proteins, yung naka-arrow. Violet, yung kulay violet dyan. Yan yung docking proteins. Again ha, kapag yung may movement na ng stored neurotransmitter, okay? May movement na ng neurotransmitter that will cause the vesicles to bind to these docking proteins, okay? Now, later sa ato ang discussion, naatay na ma-mention ng mga docking proteins later sa mga preceding discussion. But for now, let us just have the step-by-step na synaptic neurotransmission occurrence. Okay? Now, kapag nakapag-bind na ngayon yung stored neurotransmitter or yung mismong vesicle sa docking protein, this will cause fusion of vesicles to the cell membrane. Kapag sinabing fusion, of course, it will combine, it will fuse, it will mix, no? Magkakaroon ng fusion yung vesicles into the cell membrane. Okay? Mag-fuse sila, didikit ba? Okay? Yung mismong vesicle sa cell membrane ng presynapse, causing the process called exocytosis. Okay? So, yan yung nangyayari. Okay? Again, kapag nakapag-bind na ang vesicles, ang stored neurotransmitter into the docking protein, that will cause exocytosis. And ano ba yung exocytosis? Okay? Recall that exocytosis is a process of release of neurotransmitters. Okay? That is why in general, kapag nakapasok na yung calcium ion sa presynaptic cell membrane, that will later lead to exocytosis. That will lead to release, no, of neurotransmitters from its vesicles. Okay? So, we're done with exocytosis. Natapos natin until exocytosis na step. Okay? That is number 6. No? Step number 6. So with this, we can tell that the neurotransmitters are now found in the cleft. No? Ayan. The neurotransmitters are now found here. Diba? After exocytosis, na-release na yung, na-release na yung neurotransmitters sa cleft. Okay? Mula pre-synapse, mula sa iyang vesicles, nga nandoon, present sa pre-synapse, na-release na siya into the cleft. Tandaan, kapag nasa cleft na yung mga neurotransmitters, they are now available. They are now available for action. When we say they are now available for action, ibig sabihin, they are now liberated to whatever action they carry. Okay? And of course, one of the destinies or fate of the neurotransmitter is to bind to the receptors. Okay, that is one of the main fate, no, destiny ng mga neurotransmitter kapag available na sila sa cleft. Okay, isa yan sa mga primary fate na nila. They will bind to the receptors. Okay, and you know already that majority of the receptors are found in the post-synapse. Kaya makikita natin dito na may mga receptors. Okay? So kapag ang neurotransmitters found in the cleft, it will bind, okay, to the receptors. Now please pakitake note, binding of neurotransmitters to the receptors, binding of neurotransmitters to the receptors, that is the evidence that we have na ang impulse, ang utos, nakarating na sa other structure, no? Nakarating na sa other neuron, 'di ba? Mula sa sending neuron, kahit may space pa dito, may gap, we have found out na the moment na nakapag-bind na yung neurotransmitter sa receptor, which is located in the postsynapse, ibig sabihin, nakapag-travel na, naka-reach na yung utos, yung impulse, to the other structure. So, proof na ito na ang balita, ang utos, mula utak, nakatawid sa kabila. Kahit may gaps, di ba? Kahit may spaces. So, yan yung concept ng synaptic neurotransmission. Okay? Binding, transmission of impulses through the synapses. Okay? Now, with that being said, ang impulse now reaches the post-synaptic cell. Okay? So, kung i-relate natin to sa skeletal illustration, ito, yung nasa taas, okay? Ibig sabihin lang nito na kahit may gaps, diba? Kahit may gap, may presence ng synaptic cleft, okay? May presence ng mismong space in between the sending neuron and the receiving neuron, and even between the receiving neuron and the effector gland, kahit may mga gaps doon, nakakarating pa rin yung impulses sa kabilang structure, no? And pagdating dito sa post-synapse, di ba? Pagdating dito sa post-synapse, the process will repeat. Okay? Kung ano yung nangyari mula pre-synapse papuntang post-synapse, kapag nakarating na yung impulse dito sa post-synapse, magre-repeat lang yung process until such time na makarating yung utos sa mismong effector organ. So overall, with these processes, we can realize that the impulse or utos has been received now by the effector cell, and therefore response will be generated already. Kasi yung mismong effector organ, siya yung mag-produce ng response, siya yung mag-produce ng effect as an effector organ. No? So that is the process or steps involved in synaptic neurotransmission. Okay? So if we go back, if we go back to our previous presentation sa slide, no? Yung discussion natin earlier, di ba, diniscuss natin yung um, all about synaptic neurotransmitter, particularly, una, we start with the parts, no? The important parts ng synapses, the pre-synapse, post, and the synaptic left. Okay, and then second, we have the steps involved in uh, synaptic neurotransmission. So may kinalaman to lahat ha, may kinalaman ito lahat sa mga drugs later on. So overall, we're done with synaptic neurotransmission. And if you are to check the flow of our discussion, you already know about nervous system. Kilala niyo na yung somatic and autonomic nervous system and ang processes involved in synaptic neurotransmission. So somehow, may confidence, may idea na kayo somehow to know more about autonomic nervous system. So at this juncture, we will give focus on autonomic nervous system. Recall natin na under autonomic nervous system, this is said to be a two-neuron setup. No? It has two neurons. It connects the CNS to its effector organ. May presence ng preganglion, merong postganglion, the ganglion. And this is said to be involuntary. No? What else? Between stimulus and response, yung related dito would be response, no? Kasi autonomic nervous system is under motor pathways. So, response. And when it comes to efferent ba or afferent, this is much more related to efferent. Kasi we're talking about motor pathways, no? Efferent neurons. Okay? Now, proceed tayo. Let me tell you that there are three major subdivisions of autonomic nervous system. Okay, three major subdivisions, and these are the enteric, sympathetic, and the parasympathetic nervous system. Again, there are three major subdivisions under autonomic nervous system, although kanina sa first few slides ng concept maps about nervous system, only two divisions were presented under autonomic nervous system, but actually there are three, no? But in this topic, okay, on pharmacology of ANS, the drugs that will be discussed later on are only drugs that affects parasympathetic nervous system and sympathetic nervous system. So we will not discuss drugs that affects enteric nervous system. Okay, this is just to tell you that there are three subdivisions under ANS. So focusing to parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system, number one information about them is that they are quite opposite from one another. Kumbaga yung mga responses, yung effects that is being produced per subdivisions, no, between para and sympathetic nervous system, baliktaran lang. Okay, very opposite yung effects nila. And to easily understand the characteristics of these two subdivisions under ANS, we will utilize the tables, no? You will utilize tables to easily understand the differences or distinguish the differences between parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. In particular, upon studying their differences, when we study their differences ng parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system, we will consider two factors or two um, criterias. Okay? We will consider the differences ng dalawa based on anatomical feature and uh, and then the other one is based on effects. Okay, based on effects or functions. Okay, on selected organs. Right? So ito yung gagamitin natin na basihan in order to distinguish the differences between parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. Okay? So unahin natin ang sa structures or sa anatomical differences. Okay? Anatomical structure differences ng subdivisions under ANS. So this table shows the anatomical differences existing between sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system. Again, yung basehan natin dito is anatomical criterion. Okay, anatomical criterion. Okay? Kindly change this. Ito. Kindly change this part here. Change that into origin. No? Origin or roots of neurons. Ayan. So, for the anatomical criterion, let's start with origin or roots of neurons. Now, let us first understand the term origin or roots of neurons. Sige, illustrate ko muna dito. Ayan. Para mas madaling maintindihan, no? Ano ba ibig sabihin ng origin, roots of neurons? Recall that, di ba, whenever I draw CNS using skeletal illustration, di ba, we have, for instance, is the brain, and then we have the spinal cord. Now, take note that the spinal cord is quite long. You all know that, no? You have studied human anatomy and physiology. Spinal cord is quite long. Okay, and under the physiology, anatomical feature, there are different regions in the spinal cord. No, may mga regions ng spinal cord. Example, may cervical, lumbar region, thoracic region, and so on and so forth. Okay? So yung point ko lang here is, with this length of spinal cord, which is really quite long, okay, with this length ng spinal cord, may mga nakakabit na neurons, no? May mga nakakabit na neurons in certain areas of spinal cord. Kumbaga, na ay nakatanom na neurons. Okay? In specific areas ng spinal cord. So, magdedepende, or let's say, pwede nating ma-identify kung sympathetic ba or parasympathetic nervous system, depende kung saang region ng spinal cord nakakabit yung mismong neuron. So, for instance, kapag sinabing sympathetic nervous system, yung mismong sympathetic neurons, okay, yung mismong sympathetic neurons, yung origin nila ay rooted in the thoracic region, okay, in the thoracic region and in the lumbar region of the spinal cord. That is why in some other references, no, sympathetic nervous system is also known as thoracolumbar nervous system. Okay? Thoracic region, lumbar region of spinal cord. Okay? Diba? These are part of anatomy of the body, anatomy of the spinal cord. Okay? That is why with this table, with this whole table, we distinguish the differences of sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system based on anatomy, anatomical features. Okay? Now, still under sympathetic, no? Still under sympathetic neurons, sympathetic neurons. Again, they are found or originated in the thoracolumbar region, thoracic and lumbar region. Please note that these sympathetic neurons are specifically originated um, in thoracic 1 to thoracic 12. Okay, so T1 to T12, merong sympathetic neuron. Again, thoracic 1 until thoracic 12, merong sympathetic neurons. And also, okay, nakakabit din yung mga sympathetic neurons specifically sa lumbar 1, okay, lumbar 1 to lumbar 5. Alright, again, may sympathetic neurons from lumbar 1 to lumbar 5 and thoracic 1 to 12. So that's for sympathetic nervous system or region of its neurons. Now, next, parasympathetic naman. Okay, parasympathetic nervous system, this is also known as craniosacral nervous system because there are cranial nerves, diba? There are cranial nerves and sacral nerves that specifically carry parasympathetic responses. In particular, these are the cranial nerves. So let go ha. Okay, these are the cranial nerves 3. Okay, 3, 7, 9. Okay, this is comma. 9 and cranial nerve 10 also. Again, ito yung mga cranial nerves na parasympathetically innervated. 3, 7, 9, and 10. 3, 7, 9, and 10. Next, sacral nerves. Okay? Sacral nerves naman, ito yung nasa pinaka-terminal part ng spinal cord. When I say pinaka-terminal part ng spinal cord, kanang duol na bitaw sa anus. Okay? So, yan yung terminal part ng spinal cord. Somehow, andoon yung mga cranial nerves. Now, there are sacral portion that have cholinergic or parasympathetic neurons also, particularly from sacral nerve 2 until sacral nerve 4. So from S2 to S4. Okay. Again, parasympathetic neurons that is rooted in craniosacral region of spinal cord. So overall, that is for the origin of the neurons. Okay? For their first anatomical differences. Next, another differences based on anatomy, no? Another differences of sympathetic parasympathetic nervous system is on the length of neurons. Okay? Now, let me ask you first, before we proceed to the length of neurons, let me ask you, how many neurons in sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system? How many neurons are there in sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system? There are, yes, there are 2 neurons. Recall, nga sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system in general are under ANS. And I have discussed earlier that autonomic nervous system ANS is a two neuron system. There are two neurons, no? If this is the brain, ayan, if this is the brain and the spinal cord, there are two neurons, okay, that connects or bridges the CNS to the effector organ, okay? And there are certain terminologies of the neurons that is involved in the ANS. Diba? Yung first neuron, this is the preganglion. The second neuron, that is the postganglion. Naalala? Okay. So we have the preganglion, neuron 1, postganglion, neuron 2. Now, when we talk about length of neurons, no? Length ng neurons. So, ito lang yon. Ano yung length ng preganglion and postganglion kapag sympathetic neuron and parasympathetic neurons? Okay. Now, if this is the brain and the spinal cord, sabi dito, sympathetic neuron, yung preganglion niya, yung malapit sa CNS, preganglion, is short. Okay? Then yung postganglion is longer. Okay? Then you have the effector gland. Okay? So preganglion short, postganglion long. So yan yung length. Simply the length of the neurons, the preganglion and the postganglion neurons. Then for the parasympathetic or cholinergic neurons, if this is the brain ulit and the spinal cord, sabi dito, preganglion is long. So you have a long preganglion. Then you have a short, ayan, postganglion. Alright? Yan yung length ng neurons. Then we have the location of the ganglion. Okay? Location of the ganglion. Okay. It has something to do with the illustration under length of neuron. Diba? If this is the pre-ganglion and we have the post-ganglion, okay? This part here would be the ganglion, itong orange part here. No? This would be the ganglion. Okay? Itong part na to, this is the ganglion. Now, when we say location of the ganglion, we simply identify is it near the CNS, okay, or particularly near the spinal cord, or is it near on the effector organ or effector gland, okay, or target organ. So for sympathetic nervous system, the ganglion is actually near the spinal cord, knowing that the preganglion is shorter. Diba? It is a preganglion that is near the CNS. Therefore, the ganglion here, okay, the ganglion would be malapit sa spinal cord. Kasi shorter yung preganglion for sympathetic nervous system. Whereas for parasympathetic nervous system, if this is the ganglion, okay, then you have a shorter length ng postganglion. Therefore, malapit this time yung ganglion sa effector organ. This is simply based on the length of the neuron, okay, to distinguish the location of the ganglion. Okay, so take note, somehow related yung length of neurons para ma-identify mo yung location of the ganglion. Okay? To know also these two criteria, anatomical criteria in distinguishing the differences of sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. I repeat, sympathetic nervous system, the location of ganglion is near the spinal cord. Parasympathetic nervous system, The location of ganglion is near the effector organ.